Breathless, he burst into the class. The professor was by now used to his late arrivals. He made it to his seat and breathed a sigh of relief. He saw 2 problems on the board and quickly jotted them down. He wasn't particularly fond of homework, and these looked exceptionally difficult. This is going to take some time, he thought to himself. Hello everyone, and welcome to our channel. Today we have a story about a young boy whose homework ended up changing the entire world. Remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more of our exciting videos. Click on that little bell icon so that you'll never miss a story. George was not born to a particularly wealthy family. His parents were, however, well learned and had high aspirations for their children. Little George was named after the great writer George Bernard Shaw. His parents hoped that their first child would become a writer. His father was a mathematician and linguist. His mother was also a linguist. After moving to the USA, his father became a math tutor at the University of Maryland, College Park, while his mother received work as a linguist at the Library of Congress. Ever since he was a young boy, George's father challenged him with complex math problems, particularly in projective geometry. As time went by, George himself developed a passion for geometry. George later recounted this experience with his father. He gave me thousands of geometry problems while I was still in high school. The mental exercise required to solve them was a great gift from my father. Solving thousands of problems at the time when my brain was growing did more than anything else to develop my analytic power. After graduating from high school, George decided to study mathematics at the University of Maryland, where his father was on the mathematics faculty. Given their financial status, his parents could not send their son to a more prestigious university. But George was content. He worked hard and received his bachelor's in mathematics and physics in 1963. His grades were nothing exceptional, but his parents were still proud of him. In the summer of the same year, George fell in love with a beautiful maiden named Annie and got married. The newly married couple moved to their home where George began his graduate studies in abstract mathematics. As time went by, George became increasingly disconnected from his studies. He did not find any interest in abstract mathematics. The only classes he truly enjoyed were on statistics, so George gave up his studies. However, George never lost his interest in statistics. A few weeks later, he began reading some statistics done by Professor Neyman, and his interest was sparked. George wrote to Professor Neyman to arrange a teaching assistantship with him. For the second time, George began his graduate studies under Neyman. George was racing to his class. He was now a first-year student at Berkeley and extremely late for his class. He sneaked in and took his seat. Neyman had scrawled 2 problems on the board. George scribbled them down in his book. Must be homework, he thought to himself. George stared long and hard at his book. What were these problems? By the looks of it, it would take days to solve. Maybe he missed something important at the beginning. No way he could ask for help and admit that he was late. Poring over his books, George realized just how difficult the problems were. He was kicking himself for being late. As the hours wore on, George knew that he would not be able to hand in this homework on time. The clock ticked on. George had yet to solve the problem. He rummaged through books and almost pulled his hair out trying to solve it, but he loved the challenge. Scrunching over the numbers was his passion, and he was determined, now more than ever, to solve the problems. A few days later, George was all smiles. He finally solved it, but it was long overdue. He wondered how Neyman would react. George braced himself and walked to the professor. Neyman was busy at work. George apologized to Neyman for taking so long to do the homework. The problem seemed a little harder than usual. Neyman was concentrating so much on his work that he nodded at George dismissively. He asked Neyman if he still wanted the work. Still focused on his own work, Neyman told George to just throw it on his desk. George looked at the desk. It was overflowing with books, papers, and all kinds of stuff. Naaman was too deep in work to care. Reluctantly, George put his book on the desk, although he feared that his homework would be lost there forever. The days went by, and George got no response from Naaman. Had he messed up the problems? Or worse, had Naaman lost his hard work altogether? George wondered whether he should remind his professor about the work he submitted. It was a Sunday morning, about 6 weeks later. George and his wife were sleeping late. Suddenly, around 8 o'clock, the couple was awakened by a loud banging noise. Someone was at the front door. They looked at each other in astonishment. Slowly, George padded over to the front door and opened it carefully. He was almost knocked off his feet when someone crashed the door open and burst into his house. With his fist clenched, George turned. It was Naaman. He was standing in the middle of his house, clutching a stack of papers with a crazed look in his eyes. George stared at his professor in surprise. What was the meaning of this? Had something happened at the university? Quickly, quickly, Newman cried. Read this, now! Newman thrust a fistful of papers at George. When George just stood there with a confused look painted over his face, Newman started to explain. I've just written an introduction to one of your papers. Read it so I can send it out right away for publication. George was dumbfounded. An introduction to what? What was he talking about? Seeing that George had no idea of what was going on, Newman finally calmed down and cleared things out. The two questions that George had pored over were not assignments. In fact, they were not meant to be solved at all. The two problems were two famous unsolved problems in statistics. The two problems were unproven statistical theorems for which some of the greatest minds in the world had tried to work out proofs but failed. George had worked it out in a matter of days. Until that time, George had simply thought that he had missed something important, and his carelessness made the problem seem hard. Now everything was starting to make sense. George paled over. He slumped onto a chair as the realization dawned on him. He, a mere graduate student, had solved the unsolvable. He would later be respected for the development of the simplex algorithm in 1947, an algorithm for solving linear programming problems. It grew out of his work with the US Air Force, where he became an expert on planning methods solved with desk calculators. One of the first applications of the simplex algorithm was to the determination of an adequate diet for the military that was of least cost. The linear programming methods were of great importance and shaped the development of today's technology. Laszlo Lovász, an award-winning mathematician, described the importance of linear programming as, if one would take statistics about which mathematical problem is using up most of the computer time in the world, then the answer would probably be linear programming. But George would remain his humble and modest self throughout the years. Writing on his simplex algorithm, he stated that the tremendous power of the simplex method is a constant surprise to me. Even at that time, George was rather humble about his achievement. A year after he solved the problems, he began to worry about a thesis topic. He consulted Naaman, who just shrugged and told George to wrap the two problems in a binder and he would accept them as the thesis. The second of the two problems, however, was not published until after World War II. A person named Abraham Wald contacted George saying that the main result in his paper was the same as the second homework problem. George humbly allowed Abraham to publish the work with him as a mere co-author. The story passed on to become an urban legend in and around the university premises, which soon spread to other parts of America. A sermon in a church in Middle America hailed George as having solved 10 problems as part of his final exams. George simply laughed off the exaggerations. George's story is the perfect example of how a positive mindset can achieve the impossible. To him, the problems weren't unsolvable, so he pushed himself harder to complete his work. In George's mind, the problems could be solved if he just worked hard enough. Unlike most real great achievements, George didn't solve it for the fame or the glory, not even for the greater good. He simply wanted to finish his homework on time. The simpleness is probably the source of his humility throughout the years. His actions later inspired a book on positive thinking. The moral of the story was, if George had known that the problems were not his homework, but were in fact two famous unsolved problems in statistics, he probably would not have thought positively, would have become discouraged, and would never have solved them. The very thought that these were problems that could be solved was more powerful than the greatest minds of the century. What would you have done if you got some near impossible homework? Let us know in the comments, and make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more mind-blowing videos. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.